His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I would be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. That's the Balfour Declaration. And my name is Geoffrey Clarfield, and I'd like to welcome you to this event. I'm the Executive Director of the Masood Freedom Foundation, the Speakers Action Group, and the Project Manager of Canadians for Balfour 100, which is a special project of the Speakers Action Group. Tonight, like yourselves, I came here to listen to three remarkable men who are called public intellectuals, and very often that's used as a snide and sarcastic thing, but I think we have to recognize it for the truth that it is. And it's a tradition that goes back to the Athenian Agora, when Socrates took philosophy to the street. And so, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to this event this evening, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will be managing the rest of the evening, Miles Smith. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. Thanks to all of you for joining this evening. My purpose is to say as little as possible so that we have as much time together with all of you and with our very distinguished panelists. We're delighted to have everyone here. And the only purpose I have at start is a few words of honors and a few words of housekeeping. As regards the honors, obviously we're honored to have all of you here to commemorate in discussion a historic milestone in the liberation of the Middle East from strife and what we hope will be an ongoing history of reconsecration of the region to peace. We are honored to be effecting the collaboration of four terrific organizations, the Canadians for Balfour 100, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, the Speakers Action Group, and the Masood Freedom Foundation. It's a privilege to work with these people, and I'd like to say on everyone's behalf a word of thanks and honor for a chance to work together with the army of volunteers who made this event come together so smoothly, who've seen you to your seats, and who've provided you with materials and made everything run, as well as, of course, the staff here at the Isabel Bader Theatre. It's an honor to work with Goldie and Geoffrey and Irving and Shirley Ann, who, by the way, is having a birthday today on this event. And of course, finally, it is really an honor to be on stage with these three fine fellows. It's a pan-Abrahamic panel, and it is individuals who are 100% Stockholm Syndrome free. The elaborated bios are found in your material, so I'll just say a sort of descriptive word of why these three people came to the attention of Canadians. Salim Mansour is one of the most prominent and early Canadians to ask why, whether it's in a country like India or whether it's in Canada, Muslims or people of any faith can't have both their religion and their culture on the one hand and Shakespeare on the other hand. Ezra is probably the one who first taught Canadians always to bring your own camera with you to an interview, especially if it's with an administrative law body. And also, I think he taught us that if someone takes your megaphone away, you can always get your own and build your own media empire, which is inspiring in an age in which we seek to have as many voices. Jordan Peterson is well known to many of you by now. We had him at an event that, although it was free, sold out, so to speak, before many of us in the organization even knew it was being held. And for a lot of young Canadians and people of student age, part of the interest may be that he's the first person that they've seen demonstrate what it's like to take a high-profile stand for free speech, especially in the service of broader and free inquiry. And I think he also taught us the value of that adage that sometimes you have to punch the wall because there's actually no wall there. So with that, a few words of housekeeping. We're going to hear from each of our panelists for about 20 minutes, and the perspective very broadly is on the Balfour Declaration and significance not just for the Jewish community or Israel as a nation, but also for Christians and Jews. It's my first pleasure to welcome to the stage, if that's where he'd like to make his remarks, Salim Mansour.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you, and the organizers, and I also want to congratulate them for taking the time, putting in the effort to get this event to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration was, in a sense, the keystone in the plinth, the foundation that was laid, which eventually led to the establishment of the Jewish State of Israel in 1948. So I want to begin with a little bit of history and then put it in some context, the Balfour Declaration, and sum up my own thoughts in terms of what could and might have been possible and the missed opportunities, in a sense. The Balfour Declaration was simply, in the beginning, November 1917, a letter written on behalf of the British government by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, and addressed to Lord Rothschild, who was representing the Zionists in Britain, the Zionist organization in Britain, indicating to them that the British government would be willing to see that a Jewish homeland is established in Palestine. It was a statement, a letter, a policy, and no more than that. It could have been revoked at any other time. In fact, the weeks following the letter sent to Lord Rothschild, the government of David Lloyd and his emissaries were engaged in secret negotiation with representative of the Ottoman ruler, Enver Pasha, in Geneva, Switzerland, trying to see if they could arrange a separate peace with the Ottomans and get them out of the war so that the Entente powers, Britain, France, Russia, could then concentrate on defeating Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's one of the big ifs. If the Ottoman had gone along with that secret negotiation, what would have happened? The statement that had been released to Lord Rothschild. So in a sense, the Balfour Declaration survived. It was translated later on into an agreement, a treaty, recorded into the United League of Nations Palestine Mandate, and it became then a part of an international agreement backed by the great powers. But there was all that possibility of it being derailed. In 1922, Lord Balfour was in the House of Lords, and there was a motion that was being pushed to reject the Palestine Mandate. When Lord Balfour rose in the House of Lords and he spoke in support of the declaration that bore his name, his biographers have noted that he spoke with a great deal of passion. For the first time, people saw the intensity of his emotion. He was a very private man. He was a bachelor. He was first an academic and a scholar, a philosopher, before he was a lawyer. But on this occasion in 1922, he led the opposition to the motion on the floor. And he said, and I want to quote to you what he said on that occasion in 1922. There was a great deal involved in Britain's sponsorship of the Jews' return to their homeland. This is the ideal in which chiefly moves me, that Christendom is not oblivious to their faith, is not unmindful of the service they have rendered to the great religions of the world, and that we desire to the best of our ability to give them the opportunity of developing in peace and quietness under British rule those great gifts which hitherto they have been compelled to bring to fruition in countries which know not their language and belong not to their race. The motion was defeated, but Balfour was not the Foreign Secretary. It was now, the Foreign Secretary was Lord Curzon. And what occurred after the defeat of this motion was a release of a white paper which led to the partitioning of Palestine under Lord Curzon and the Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. And 70+% of historic Palestine, the land east of the River Jordan, was separated from the land west of the River Jordan and given over to Abdullah, son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, as the Emir of Transjordan. So ironically, the Balfour Declaration was saved, but an Arab state was created, the state of Transjordan, the Emirate of Transjordan, which is now Jordan. And so indeed, there is an Arab state. What remained was less than 1% of the total land area of the Ottoman Empire between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, which now constitutes the states of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So that 1% remained, and that 1% would then become a matter of great deal of political maneuvering during the interwar years. Okay, so let me just then back up and give you, in a sense, the context of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. The context is that the year 1917 became a very critical year. In 1916, December, a new government in London took power under the premiership of David Lloyd, and there was a pressure now built up to bring some sort of a conclusion to the war on the Eastern Front, that is, with the Ottoman. In 1916, the Arab Revolt began in June of 1916, and the flag was raised by the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And the British were desperately interested to see that the Arab Revolt succeed and draw down the Ottoman troops in their area so that they could knock out the Ottoman Empire from the war. In the opening months of 1917, the United States entered the war. And so that meant that by the time the United States mobilized and the pressures came on the Western Front, Britain and France were strategically interested to settle the issue in the Eastern Front. So there was a complex set of negotiation that was undertaken by the British in 1916 and 1917. Britain was engaged in what I might call a quadrangular relationship. One with Russia as an allied power in the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. The other with France, which came to be, in a sense, consummated with the Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916. The third with the Arabs, which is to get them to mobilize and raise the flag of rebellion, the Arab revolt with Sharif Hussein of Makkah. And only lastly, in September of 1917, a serious engagement began with the Jewish representatives in London, led by Chaim Weizmann, about considering the Jewish claim to establish a homeland in Palestine, a claim that had begun about 2 decades earlier with the work of Herzl, when Herzl published his book, The Jewish State, in 1896, and in 1897, the first Congress of the World Organization took place in Basel, Switzerland. It is interesting to note that it was exactly 20 years between Herzl's launching the campaign for a Jewish homeland in Palestine and the passage of the Balfour Declaration. But what we have to keep in mind, for the British government and the French, there were other priorities, and they were working on those priorities more seriously, with the focus primarily in defeating the Ottoman Empire. If I may just backtrack a little bit over here, again, to contextualize, the man most responsible for the Jewish effort to establish a homeland in Palestine was, of course, Herzl. He is singularly responsible. His book in 1896 galvanized the Jewish opinion, the whole idea for 2 millennia that see you next year in Jerusalem was translated by Herzl into a practical problem, seeking a practical solution to which he devoted his life. So between 1896 and he died in 1904, 8 years, his work had brought this issue right into the capitals of the great powers. Herzl went around and met with all the leaders. He met with the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, in 1898 in Jerusalem. He met with the Sultan of the Ottoman Sultan and the Caliph of Islam, Abdul Hamid II, several times. He went to Rome and he met with the Pope, Pius X, to get his blessing for the effort behind his campaign. But he didn't go very far. It is the war that changed the situation. Wars have consequences. And great wars, as was the war of 1914-18, would have great and far-reaching consequences. And so it is in the context of that war that the issue emerged, the Balfour Declaration emerged. Okay, the point, am I running out of time or I still have some time? Large and complex history, but the point I want to drive here is that while Herzl was rebuffed in his effort, and it is the war situation that changed it, the interesting thing to note here, and hopefully we can expand that in our conversation, is that while Balfour was rebuffed by the Pope, almost insultingly, that your people have not recognized our Savior, and therefore they have no place in Palestine. And if they do go to Palestine, then we will have the churches and the priests ready to baptize them. But on the other hand, his meeting with Sultan Hamid, the Caliph of Islam, was, according to his biographers, very warm. The Caliph offered Herzl charter for Mesopotamia. He was reluctant for Palestine, and he was willing to give Herzl and the World Zionist Organization the license for mining natural resources in Fertile Crescent, including oil. And the point here is, the most interesting point, is that from the perspective of the Muslim, the Caliph of Islam, there was no theological objection to the Jews coming back to Palestine. The Caliph knew that in Jerusalem, for instance, on the outbreak of the war, the population of Jerusalem was about 60,000, and 2/3 of that population, over 40,000, were Jews. And that the Jewish settlements on both sides of the Jordan had a population of over 85,000 people. And so, the big question that hangs over our head years later, and all that we've gone through in the 100 years, is what could have happened, might have happened, if instead of the war that the Arabs launched against the Jews in the 1920s, which is continuing right up to this time, they had turned around and embraced the Jews and accepted that Jews have their rights, which the Quran itself testifies to in Palestine. That is in ancient Judean Samaria, the name Palestine given by the Romans, and that Jerusalem is the eternal capital city. That possibility was very much there, but in the complexity of the situation that emerged, I wrap this up with the observation that Jewish nationalism came into collision with Arab nationalism, and the result has been disastrous in a sense for the Arabs and the Muslims. Perhaps reflecting back on it, we might open up the avenue for the dialogue and the embracing of the Jews in their ancient land that can lead to the betterment of the Arabs, as the Caliph of Islam himself envisaged at the time that he was speaking with Herzl. Thank you.
Well, Professor, you're a tough act to follow. It's great to see you. I want to say thanks to Joffrey for the invitation. And on the way in, I saw some police officers, and they recognized me from the last time I had an event on this street. And it was with Professor Peterson in attendance as well. And a group of masked thugs tried to storm the room. In fact, outside they flipped over tables. They had their faces obscured. The police held the line, and so the event continued within. But of course, being frustrated, they pulled the fire alarms, and the police had no other choice but to evacuate the buildings. That's what it's like sometimes to try to have a discussion about anything controversial whatsoever in modern life. In the West, in universities in particular. And so I want to say thanks to the men and women in blue here tonight for keeping us safe, and so far, for keeping the fashion today. And, you know, many people in academia and in the media, myself included, sometimes criticize police. I can tell you that when there's a mob of masked men looking to smash you, we realize who our real friends are, and that blue lives matter. Now, unlike my two friends, I'm not a scholar. I know that will shock you. But what's interesting about both Professor Menser and Professor Peterson is how, because they have views that aren't even controversial in any deep, essential way, just opinions. But because they're out of vogue with the official narrative, in their own way, both men have been marginalized and have paid a personal price for simply stating views that in the past would have been interesting or controversial at most, but they've been flattened by various forms of authority. And Professor Mansour, in his own way, we've talked before about how because you are not following the official narrative of being anti-Zionist, you're the opposite, that has marginalized you in academia and in fact in some parts of the Muslim community. And Professor Peterson, it's been an international spectacle of how you have been censured, and for the first time in your academic career, denied research funding for your master's students, a shocking act of violation of academic freedom. But the fact that you're here today, invited in this beautiful room, and you're resilient, I think gives us all hope. And Professor Peterson in particular, your use of media, YouTube, social media, I think you have 250,000 YouTube viewers, should give everyone hope that if the authorities, if the establishment denies you one platform, in this day and age with some creativity, you can find yourself another one. I read the Balfour Declaration yesterday thinking I better prepare today. And to be honest, I think it's the first time I've ever read it in my life. And I have to say I found it unremarkable. Other than how brief it was, I don't find it remarkable at all, other than Jews are interested in it for personal reasons. Israelis might be interested in it for historical reasons. I understand why we're meeting to talk about its centenary. I suppose, for example, it refutes the claim that the State of Israel's founding was just some appeasement to the Jews for the Holocaust. Well, in 1917 it was promised for its own reasons. I think it proves obviously in some way that Jews predate 1948 in Israel, despite extremist attempts to deracinate Jews from Jerusalem and Israel in general. I think it's a reminder that at that time, the word Palestinian often referred to Jews. What we call the Jerusalem Post today was called the Palestine Post. The Palestinian Brigade in the Second World War were Jews, actually. So it's useful in those ways, but I say again, I found it unremarkable. No more remarkable, I would think, than a declaration today that perhaps the Kurds should have their homeland. In fact, less controversial than that, I think, because the Kurdish homeland, well, does that extend into Turkey, and who has the authority to break up a country? This was an empire saying we will one day concede territory that we control for the Jewish purpose. And over the next 50 or 60 years, how many dozens of countries had the same decolonization from the UK? I mean, if you were to go throughout Africa and other parts of the world, even Asia, the Caribbean, how many versions of the Balfour Declaration would there be? Every Commonwealth country emanated from the British Empire, some before, some after Israel. I would say that the Balfour Declaration was no more controversial than any of those. I would say that Israel's decolonization and becoming an independent state was more successful than most, measured by democratic successes, economic successes, sovereignty resisting so many attacks, both formal military attacks and terrorism. I think if you look around the world, even especially its immediate neighbors, but even in most countries around the world, I think the only way that Israel stands out by most meaningful ways is that it is more successful than more countries that were decolonized from the British Empire. But I had tuned out Israel and Jewish and Palestinian and terrorism issues for quite a long time. I was just overdosed on them. And I hadn't been to Israel for 10 years until I went recently this spring with some of my colleagues from the Rebel Media. And I thought I sort of knew it already and would be tired to hear it, but I learned something this trip that I didn't know before. And I later verified it for myself. I had heard when I was in Israel a couple months ago that all of Israel's wars and all of its terrorist attacks combined over the last century, so going back to the Balfour Declaration, really since the 20s, 30s, 40s, the War of Independence in 48, all the other conflicts, Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War, the incursion into Lebanon, all the intifadas, the total casualties on both sides, so not just on the Israeli side, but on the Palestinian side, on other foreign Arab countries, the total casualties over the course of 1 century was just over 100,000. Now, of course, any one death in a war, a terrorist attack, is a tragedy, but we have to have some perspective in an era when hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been killed in 5 years by their own government, by terrorist insurgents in Libya, where massacres happen by ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Looking at the horrors of the region, the subject that so obsesses international opinion, the United Nations, the diplomatic corps, the media corps, the political establishment, is so incredibly disproportionate. I mean, just do a little tour around the region. Erdogan and his mass arrests and the coup against him, whether it was a real or a false flag. Look at that horror show. Look at the way he treats Americans when he and his entourage come to Washington, D.C. just this week. Look at what's going on in Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the entire region is aflame. By comparison, Israel is the most placid place in the region. It is the closest thing to a solution in the region, and even some Arab states are saying so, and not just in private anymore. Israel may actually be a solution to some of the military or terroristic or nuclear problems in the region. One thing I knew from my last trip to Israel a decade ago was that even the security barrier, it's mainly a fence, and a few percentage of its miles is a wall between that separates Jewish communities and Arab communities, that was built to stop suicide bombers who would just walk across a field and blow themselves up. There have been dozens of lawsuits to the Israeli Supreme Court to change the path of that fence. And in all the cases, Aaron, that's the phrase from the movie The Matrix, do you want to see the harsh reality and come to terms with it? Take the red pill. Or do you want to go back to your illusion? Take the blue pill. Israel is red pilled in the era of terrorism, anti-democratic forces. Israel is the society that is no longer going through security theater, that's no longer pretending there aren't issues, and a borderless society works. And I think in many ways, although Israel has more terrorism problems and problems with Islamic radicalism than Western countries, because they have come to terms with them and are willing to call them by the proper name, I think in some ways that it's safer to be in Israel, because at least they call the threat by its own name. How many minutes do I have left? 7 minutes? I'm just going to unlock my iPhone where I put my very rough notes. I think that on campuses and in the media, the Palestinian issue is grossly disproportionate, but I don't even think it's legitimate. I think it is just as when the decline and defeat of the Soviet Union came, Marxism and socialism rebundled itself, for example, in environmentalism. So the anti-industry, anti-corporate, anti-capitalist mentality well-founded. So I guess I'm here to say I'm learning a lot about the Balfour Declaration, but I actually don't think it's an important issue. I think it's what the other side wants to make an important issue. It's good to know the rebuttals to their junk history and junk claims, but I think we should have an earlier step, which is to call the bluff on anyone who says Israel and its relations with its neighbors is an important world problem. I just don't think it is. Thank you.
So I puzzled over this for quite a while, pretty much right up to the last 2 or 3 hours before the talk. I thought, what in the world am I doing at this talk? So the first hypothesis I generated was that maybe I was an amateur historian. And you know, one of the things you learn when you're trying to teach something is just bloody well how little you know about it. And so I started to dig more deeply into the history of the Balfour Declaration, although I knew Salim was going to cover it. And you know, I could give a pretty credible 20-minute presentation on the history of the Balfour Declaration, but it didn't sit well with me because it isn't the right thing for me to be talking about. It's not my area of expertise. And to say anything about the political situation, like anything definitive, it's like, that just seemed like absolute hubris. You know, I mean, there's so much going on in that little corner of the world that for me to take a position of solution on it just seemed absurd. And I thought, okay, well, I'm no historian and I don't have any answers, so well, where in the world does that leave me? Then I thought, well, I remembered something that Hans Eysenck, who's a very famous psychologist, said about the complexity of the world, let's say. And that formulating the damn problem is often a really good step to solving it. And I thought, well, I can certainly see where the problems are, and maybe I can see them from a psychological perspective. And so what I ended up doing was listing a bunch of problems. And so I'm going to talk to you about why. You see, it was kind of interesting today how this laid itself out, because Salim provided some history, and then Ezra talked personally and historically, but he also talked psychologically. You know, one of the questions that he raised, not explicitly, precisely, but implicitly, but evidently, was like, who cares? Why is this so important? Why is this little ratty part of the world that's like just scraped out of useless desert, fundamentally? Why in the world is everyone obsessed with it? You know, and it's really something. It's always struck me. And so I thought, well, maybe that was something a psychologist could talk about. You know, one of the things that struck me when Ezra was speaking is that, you know, maybe even the enemies of the Jews perversely respect them because they've done so well in the Middle East that it's just annoying. Hey, you don't want to be thinking that success is necessarily going to attract admiration, right? I mean, we know from the Cain and Abel story that success can attract murderous resentment and the desire to destroy. And so that's just one of the problems, I think, is that in some ways Israel is a shining beacon on the hill. And of course, in some ways, I suppose it's not. But at least in part it is, and that's something, especially in that God-forsaken part of the world. So where there's very little sign of anything resembling the city of God. And then I thought, well, let's think about Israel, and it's a small place, and the conflicts are small scale, but vital. And I was thinking today about the fact that the geographical area is small, but the psychological or spiritual area is very large, right? I mean, because Israel happens to have Jerusalem in the middle of it, which I suppose is quite amazing, but also very problematic, because Jerusalem is regarded as a holy city by all three, roughly, Western religions. And the idea of the holy city is a really interesting idea. You know, it's half geographical and half psychological. It's more psychological, from my perspective, than geographical. I suppose that's probably because well, we won't get into that, but it's more psychological than it is geographical from my perspective. But the idea of the holy city is really worth thinking about, because I think it's part of the reason that this part of the world compels so much attention, because all three Western religions have a vision, you know, and they differ in their vision, but there's some shared elements. Like, one of the shared elements is that there is such a thing as a holy city. And what's a holy city? It's a very old idea. I mean, it's a tremendously old idea. It's something like, for human beings, it's like the sanctity of the community itself, you know, because the community is a place that that's predicated on the ultimate value, and then it's walled in, and then it's surrounded by chaos and barbarism, essentially. And it's home, it's the ideal, it's the proper polity, it's the ideal state, it's the hope for the future. That's also what it is. And it's the utopia, it's heaven on earth, it's paradise, it's Eden reestablished, it's the place where all suffering disappears, right? It's the vision of humanity. And all three major Western religions agree that such a place exists, and that it actually happens to exist in Jerusalem, and that it's actually real. And that's actually quite a remarkable degree of agreement, especially about something that's so metaphysical and strange, and also so ancient. Well, it's interesting that we've come to agreement about that, although it's certainly the case that we haven't come to much agreement about exactly how the city of God should be ruled. And that's where the problems come, I suppose, because as you all know, the devil, and in this case probably literally so, is always in the details. And so I believe that Israel and Jerusalem is a microcosm of the human longing for the return of paradise, let's say that. And that we're all involved in a tremendous drama and watching it play itself out in this tiny corner of the world where Muslims and Jews and Christians are forced painfully and horribly to confront one another at the deepest level of reality. Well, so what are the problems? Well, one of them is that people lie all the time about exactly what's going on in Israel and why they're on one side or the other. They lie because they're malevolent, because they want destruction, because they're jealous, because they're anti-Semitic, because they're anti-Islamic, because they're anti-Christian, because they resent success. That's a big problem. Another problem is, well, all three religions make a group-oriented claim to rights to the territory, and then that raises a terrible specter, because it's the specter of group rights, right? Is that groups have the right to self-determination, and that groups can have a historical claim to a piece of geography. And of course that spins us into a terrible conflict between the idea of group identity and the idea of individual rights, and we have no idea how to sort that out. And then the problem of group identity and historical claims is magnified by the problem of time frame, and this is a major psychological problem, man. It's like, well, you think about, say, the common complaint that the Western colonialists say were responsible for the divisions of the Middle East. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. If you start history at 1917, after the Allies won the First World War and took down the Ottoman Empire, and in the aftermath of the collapse of the European monarchies, you could say, well, England and France had the upper hand and they arbitrarily divided up the Middle East. But you could just as easily say that, well, the damn empire had collapsed and they had to do something with it, and it wasn't obvious, and they gave some of it to the Arabs, who really didn't have any land to begin with, or not any independent land, that's for sure, because they were dominated by the Ottoman Empire, and they decided to give some of it to the Jews. And well, maybe that wasn't the world's best solution either way, but they were maybe making the best of a bad lot. I mean, that's certainly one way of thinking about it. And then, if you stretch your historical imagination back several thousand years, well, then you can say, well, the Jews have a historical claim to Palestine, let's say, and to Jerusalem. But the problem is, well, why take that particular frame of history? You can take any frame of history you want, and then the conclusions that you draw from the facts that you observe differ substantially. And that's a big psychological problem, because it's not easy to determine what the appropriate time frame is to analyze the significance of historical events, and no one knows how to deal with that problem. And so at least we could say it's a problem, because it clearly is. And it's part of the reason, I think, why Palestine and the conflict there just never leaves the Western imagination. That's another major cognitive problem, a cognitive historical problem in some sense that we don't know how to solve. We don't know how to solve the problem of proxies. It could be that the Israelis and the Palestinians would actually like peace, but it doesn't matter, because they're surrounded by people who can use them to, especially the Palestinians in my estimation, to continue to agitate for their extracurricular political motives, and if they have to sacrifice the Palestinians to do it, well, so much the better. That solves more than one problem at the same time. And so that is another indication of precisely why the problem is so absurdly complicated. There's another one too, which is the problem of group identity and the state as salvation. This is a deep problem. No one ever talks about this. You know, this is actually, I would say, one of the places where Christianity and Judaism differ most intently. And maybe I'm wrong about this, and I probably am, because I'm wrong about lots of things. But you know, it seems to me that there's more emphasis in Judaism that the state is the locus of salvation than there is in Christianity, which seems to stress the individual as locus of salvation more precisely. Now, perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle, because people have a cultural identity and an individual identity, but I'm not trying to offer solutions because I can't. I'm trying to outline problems, as we don't know how. Like, you have a group identity, which is convenient for you to use whenever you need to use it, but it's kind of annoying for everyone when someone else's group identity starts to interfere with your individual rights. And like, we're in a terrible battle in Canada and across the Western world, for that matter, with regards to the relationship between group identity and individual rights. And so that's pinpointed tremendously in Israel, right? It's like laser focus there. Well, we don't know how to deal with that. So, and then the other thing is that you could view Israel as the nexus, the pinpoint, another pinpoint, where the first world and the third world come together and clash. You know, and Israel is essentially a first world country, and it's been heavily involved, it's been heavily allied with the West, let's put it that way, and extraordinarily successfully. And Israel has a tech industry that's just booming, you know. It's amazingly well-educated society and could offer a tremendous amount to the world in the upcoming years. And it's thriving in the midst of this third world chaos. And, well, do we know what to do about that? No. And are they thriving because they're exploiting everyone around them and exploiting everyone in the state? Because that's the new idea about the West, right? Is that the reason the West thrives is because we've stolen everything of value from all the people around the world who aren't thriving. And of course, there's enough truth in that so that it's difficult just to toss it out. But of course, it's an extraordinarily malevolent argument, and it ignores completely let's say, the economic value of a peaceful, law-abiding, and honest state, which I do believe, all things considered, we actually have managed to establish in the West, if you compare the West to everywhere else in the world, except for, you know, instead of some dubious, generally radical leftist utopia, you know, one execution away from utopia. That's the vision of the left. And then there's another problem. It's like, well, it's the problem of the victim versus the oppressor, right? And it's always victim versus oppressor. That's the thing that's so awful. And I see that from a psychological perspective too, because if you think of yourself as a victim, then you don't think of yourself as an oppressor. Well, then you've got it wrong, man, because you're victim and oppressor at the same time. But it's way easier to separate the world into the victims that I'm defending, you know, and hopefully don't have to be in the same category as, because that would be, you know, then I can have my cake and eat it too. And all those terrible oppressors out there that aren't me. And, you know, that's a psychological divide, because if you're such a fool that you think you're only victim and not oppressor, then there's so much you don't know about humanity and society that well, I don't even know what the proper metaphor for that is. You haven't even begun your journey to wisdom, let's put it that way. That would be the right way to think about it. And so, you know, the whole victim versus oppressor, the horrible victim versus oppressor mythology can be laid out again in the Israeli state, and then it depends on who you want to make victim and who you want to make oppressor. It's exactly the perfect situation for that, because you can look at the historical catastrophes that assaulted the Jewish people, which are absolutely undeniable, or you can take the side of the Palestinians. Take your choice. You can do your moral virtue signaling on both sides of the argument, and so that's extraordinarily convenient, especially if you don't have anything else to do. So, and that, you know, that ties into the problem of virtual signaling, because it's also very convenient for people who want to develop a sense of their own advanced morality to take on the problems of some distant state and wave their bloody banners and their protest signs in favor of the hypothesis and proposition that they're on the side of the moral right, when they can go home to their comfortable lives and never have to lift a finger in anything resembling real effort or put any real risk into it. And of course, that's what they're taught to do in the universities, because we don't have anything better to teach young people than that at the moment. So, you know, So what's the issue? Well, the issue is why is that battle so absolutely fascinating? And the answer is because it contains a microcosm, at least of the Western world, and I mean the broad Western world, right? Muslims, Jews, Christians, the whole messy, horrible shebang of it. And it puts it in front of us every single day, every single day. And the funny thing is we can't bloody well look away from it, right? Because there's something in all of us that's maybe aiming at the city of God, and we know that it's allied in some peculiar metaphysical sense with that dusty little country and the city of Jerusalem, you know, the holy city on the hill. And it calls at all of our consciences to be better people than we are, and to treat other people properly, and to live proper lives. And we're not doing that well enough, and you can tell, because there's plenty of catastrophe that remains in the city that's supposed to be holy to all three of the fundamental cultures of our civilization. So that's all I have to say about that.
With thanks to all three of our speakers for extremely stimulating, extremely thought-provoking, and widely ranging comments that somehow seem to knit themselves back together, I think we're all very grateful. We have now a kind of in-between period where, as you put any comments or questions that you might want to ask the panels here for the ushers to collect, we have a bit of time for the group to have a bit of a moderated discussion. I was struck, Celine, in your speech very much, but also in the other talks as well, about this idea that in the first instance, in understanding what's come before and how we got here, there's a fair amount of history to be recovered, meaning that there's history that we've lost and forgotten, or perhaps it's been obscured by heavily subsidized Cold War era narratives, but there's a history to be recovered, and then also a history from which we need to recover, meaning, as Ezra was suggesting, some of the heavily laden narratives of conflict and group identity need to be laid to one side. I'm wondering from different perspectives what all of you think, whether it's in Balfour itself or in the historical period we're considering today, are some of the most important lessons that we can learn constructively going forward. I think, Professor Jordan, you were implicitly cautioning us not to look for easy solutions, especially not ones that are operative on an eschatological or global level. But what are some of the lessons that you think that we should learn from both the history and the principles that have been at work in the context of the Balfour Declaration and the period we've been discussing today?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me right away is that there was this psychologist named George Kelly. He was quite an interesting person. He sort of started what might be called the cognitive revolution in psychology after the behavioral era. And one of his observations was that human beings love, above all, to be right. And it's easy to be cynical about that, but it's not very smart, because it's not surprising, because the thing is, if you're right, you know what you're doing and your world is secure. But if you're wrong, you don't know what you're doing and your world isn't secure and you don't know where you're going. And then you're anxious and without a purpose, and people hate that. And no wonder, because it's dangerous. It's dangerous to not know where you are. And it's dangerous not to have a purpose. And so if you're not right, then you're in this chaotic domain. And so people strive to convince themselves that they're right. And I suppose the antidote to that is a kind of humility. And it's part of the reason that I believe that freedom of speech, say, is the penultimate right. And it's because you can only combat your very understandable tendency to be right by hoping to be more right in the future and to be more right than you are now. And the best way to be more right than you are now is to talk to people who don't think the same way you do, because if you talk to people who think the same way you do, then all you learn is what you already know, and if you're already stupid, then that isn't going to help you. And so, it seems to me that the evidence that you're not right is that you're suffering. Because if you were right, enough, you wouldn't be suffering. And so if you're still suffering, then you probably have something to learn, and then you should go find someone who knows something that you don't to talk to them. And then, so we've got Jews, and we've got Christians, and we've got Muslims, and they don't see the world the same way, and so maybe we could actually have a talk. And then we could get more right instead of just bloody well being right. And we could do that with perhaps less danger than the danger that we're facing right now. So it also seems to me, you know, that Canada is a good place to do this, because it's pretty peaceful here. And we have Jews and Christians and Muslims, and most of the time they're not beating each other to death, which is really a good thing, and very unlikely and highly improbable and rare. And so we have an opportunity to do things like this and start to figure out what it is that we could learn from one another, and recognize as well that we're obsessed by it and that we need to solve it. And that would be better than just being right. You know, even if you're deeply religious, fundamentalist religious, you know, and you think you've got it right, it's really hubristic, because that presumes that you are in possession of the appropriate interpretation of the divine. It's like, you have to be very careful before you make a claim like that, because you're basically identifying yourself with God. And generally speaking, that's not something that God looks upon with a lot of favor.
Well, you know, a couple of years ago, with the 250th anniversary of the Plains of Abraham, the war between the French and the English that led to the defeat of the French and so on and so forth. But we in Canada, because of the opposition in Quebec, did not go ahead in commemorating the anniversary of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1757. And I don't know who is richer or wiser because of it, but we have lost a sense of our own history. History puts us, in a sense, as markers, shows us where we have arrived from where we left and what things have changed. World War I, now looking back 100 years, was the pivotal event of modern time. World War II was simply the continuation of what began in World War I. And World War I was the end of the age of empires that had lasted for about 10,000 years ago. The world was organized around empires. People coexisted within empires. When the World War I started in Europe, there were 6 empires at war. When it ended, only Britain and France were standing, and all the other empires had collapsed. It is in the midst of that rubble Balfour Declaration stands up, I would suggest, as something very providential, because it could not have happened. It might not have happened. There were too many things going on that made it implausible for this idea that Herzl got captivated with and articulated. And then within 20 years, that came to play. And it could have been derailed again and again, and yet it survived. It became part of international law through the San Remo Agreement, through the League of Nations adoption of the Palestine Mandate, which then preceded what became the United Nations. And the United Nations inherited the Palestine Mandate and so on. So that's one element of it, to know about it, how implausible it was, and yet how providential it was that the ideas of the Balfour Declaration got translated into the making of the Jewish state. And in that context, the one little slice I wanted to share with you all in the limited time we have is there are 2 beasts in our midst which we don't want to talk about, we don't want to touch. The 2 beasts are, one is anti-Semitism, the 2,000-year-old disease from which Herzl wanted an escape for the Jewish people to establish a homeland in their ancestral land. The other beast is now what we have, Islamism gone rampant. But its origin also, ironically, is at that moment with the resistance of the Arabs to the Jews returning back to their ancestral home. And how the European and the great powers have played with that. where Britain took upon itself the responsibility through Balfour Declaration to bring into fruition a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but then it sought to abjure that promise repeatedly and then abandon it in 1948. And the Palestine, which they partitioned in 1921-22, where there is an Arab state, which is in Palestine, Jordan, which was an act of the British and the European powers. And so the Arab state exists. And Palestine was again partitioned in 1948. So that's that aspect of it, anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism goes on and on and on. It works through now the United Nations. It works through the ganging up of all the various member states against Israel, which is the only state based on international law that was created. And the other beast is, of course, Islamism. And the irony that has been forgotten because we live in a world of amnesia. People don't discuss it. Media doesn't discuss it. Muslims don't discuss it. Jews and Christians don't discuss it. That in Islam there was no theological opposition to the Jews coming back home. And as in the negotiation that took place between Herzl and the Caliph of Islam, there was this sense, and if you go back and you read that history, you go back and read the life of Herzl, the diaries of Herzl, the negotiation that was taking place with the Caliph of Islam. There was no Arab states. This was all part of the world of Islam. And the head of Islam, the Caliph of Islam, was in a sense welcoming and was willing to negotiate with Herzl some sort of arrangement where the Jewish talent would be the source of the revival of what you both have called the desert. That the return of the Jews would reawaken that part of the world, would in a sense water that thirsty land. And the Caliph of Islam was willing to negotiate that. We don't know what would have happened. Herzl died in 1904, the world swung away, the war came, and that entire world collapsed and we had entered into a new world. So from a theological point, there is no problem for the world of Islam to embrace the Jews. And what the Jews were doing, if I read to you the relevant verses of the Quran says, come back to your land. This is your land that God has given you.
This guy's a liar.
Okay? Now why is it that the Arabs, why is it that the Muslims have abandoned that idea? So to conclude, there's one thought, very interesting thought here. Hans Kuhn, the great Catholic theologian of German origin, is of the same age as Pope Benedict XVI. In fact, they were colleagues. He said, at the end of Cold War, that there will be no peace on earth unless there is peace among religions. And there will be no peace among religions unless there is dialogue among religions. And so the two beasts that rolls along now, anti-Semitism on one side, Islamism on the other side, both of them, in a sense, opposed to Jews in Palestine or Jews in their midst. It's actually the beast within us. It is we are the beast. We carry within us that hatred, that bigotry, and we are afraid to examine it. That's what has happened. Because when the Muslims examine their history, when Muslims examine the Quran and what it has to say, that all that has happened, and they have been leading on and doing for the past 100 years, and Israel and Palestine is the ground zero of the conflict. It is, how will they come to terms that they have been entirely wrong? So if you ask an Arab, if you ask a Muslim from the South Asia, what does your Quran say? And what was the Caliph of Islam doing, negotiating with Herzl? I bet you not 0.001% of Muslims would know that history. And that's why history is so important. Because it is through history we can walk through the path to the dialogue that Hans Cook was talking about.
Well, I don't remember the question, but I wish that I would have given my opening remarks to Salim to go on longer, and I've learned so much from you tonight. Thank you for that. And I don't mean to, I'm thinking back to my remarks that I found the Balfour Declaration unremarkable. I suppose I meant the fact of a decolonization and the creation of a country. That happened a lot in the 20th century. But when I think of, you know more than anyone I've ever met about this subject, actually. And I have a thought, because, again, this subject is so dominant on campus. I was studying the legal definition of anti-Semitism as published by the US State Department, because certain things that are anti-Semitic engage certain policies or actions of the US government. And they have a definition of it. It goes to delegitimization and a double standard. And I'm not going to try and recall it from memory, but there is actually a US government legal definition that they use. It's not just an abstract conversation. And it clearly distinguishes between legitimate criticism of Israel and criticism of Israel that is a false front for anti-Semitism. And thinking of that definition and thinking of all the facts that you've marshaled today, and then thinking of how dominant anti-Israel politics are on campus, it's the number one subject on campus, I suppose, after global warming. And global warming is sort of go out for a party, hey, ho, ho, but it doesn't get the passionate rage that Israel Apartheid Week would, for example. And I thought, well, let's swap out a different country, and what would it look like? And this goes to the double standard definition of anti-Semitism. Let's say there was some campus club called Italy Apartheid Week or something. And there were all these people who had never been, and they just were so mad at Italy all the time. And you'd say, all right, well, so what's going on over there? Well, you see, there's this technical thing and this and that. And you'd say, okay, maybe there's something there, but you sure hate Italy a lot. Are you sure it's a political thing, a historical thing? Or maybe you just don't like Italians. Like if someone just wouldn't change the subject and couldn't change the mind, and if there was all this money coming in and this guy just wouldn't stop talking about Italy, you'd say, you know what? That's how the obsession, and yeah, it is possible to criticize Italy in a way that you're not some anti-Italian bigot. But if you were to take the anti-Israel mania on campus, flip it into Italy or France or any other country in the world, and then put it up against the State Department definition of Israel, you would clearly see that it cannot be legitimate. The punctilious, fake science of anti-Zionism is so clearly a cover for anti-Semitism, it can't be anything else. If you saw enormous clubs with national conferences, an anti-Italian league, you would say, you guys are crazy. But they're not crazy. It's part of a mission against Israel, but also a mission against Israel-like things in the West.
So, there's horrible questions to be asked about such things, and so people don't, but I'm going to ask one of them, I think. Maybe a good minority isn't successful. Because look, anti-Semitism is a mystery, right? It's not obvious why it occurs. If you look at the history between the Christians and the Jews, you can see the Jews being accused of being identical with the people who sentenced Christ to death, let's say, or demanded his death. And that's the historical justification, but it's a weak justification, obviously, because they were all Jews at the time, so it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. And also, Well, it's also not in keeping with the spirit of the faith as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that you're obliged to do as a Christian is to understand that had you been there at the time that Christ was being led to his death, you would have been calling for it, right? Unless you assume he would have been Christ, which again I think is probably something you should probably not bother with. I mean, is something associated with anti-Semitism, do you think, a response to what appears quite bluntly to be the differential success rate of Jews across the world? I mean, they're a tiny little minority, right? They win a lot of Nobel Prizes. They occupy a lot of academic positions. And there are reasons for that, perhaps one of them being admiration of verbal learning. It goes back a very long ways. I don't think that's the only reason. But is that part of what... I mean, you can tolerate a minority if they're failures. I mean, that's what a good minority should be doing, you know. But when they start to become successful, well, that's doubly annoying, you know. Not only are they different, but they're successful. Christ, it's no wonder you want to throw them out of the damn country.
Well, I mean, Japanese, Canadians, Japanese Americans, Indian, kids from India, especially Hindu, for example. There are other demographic groups in America that are very successful. And maybe that's just a more modern, more American concept.
Yeah, they haven't been around long enough to get really annoyed at them yet, though.
You know, Prager and Telushkin, I think they say that it's something inherent in Judaism itself, the religion, that it's that the moral code is offensive to those who don't share it because it purports to be a higher morality. I think there's that theological argument. There's a political argument, but
yeah, well, I think that's part of what's happening in Israel too. Is that, you know, there's this claim by the Jewish people, let's say, to be chosen by God, to be following a higher morality, and yet there's a whole there's a mess that's unresolved in Israel, and I can't help but think that people are disappointed about it, and that's part of the reason. I know it's complicated, I know that's not the only thing, but it is really striking to me that Israel is held to a higher moral standard than virtually any other country.
That's
and
right.
There's got to be a reason for that.
Well, for 2,000 years, once the Romans destroyed the temple and dispersed the Jews as a people organized politically did not have the wherewithal to demonstrate that yes, they do cherish values of a universal nature that is therefore higher than a particular value, and that their lives have been organized around those universal values that is a higher value. They didn't have that opportunity for 2,000 years. That opportunity only came around, is what we're talking about this evening, as a result of Balfour Declaration and all that followed subsequently into the making of the State of Israel. And Israel does live. Here is again the providential and the ironical aspect of it. Does live. There are 56 Muslim majority countries in the world. There is 27 or 26 Arab states, members of the Arab League. Not one of these states, 56, 57, that is the Organization of Islamic Countries, or Cooperation, or the member states of the Arab League, who are all signatories of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, practice or live up to any aspect of that value, whether it's on the question of gender, minority, and so on and so forth, human right, individual right, freedom of speech. None, not one single Muslim majority country live up to that value. And yet, there is no Canadian Prime Minister or American President berating them and telling them, why don't you live up to the value that you have signed on? Trade with you, or we will not, give you any special treatment unless you live up
Yeah, well,
to the values. But here's the point, which I'm coming to, Jordan. Israel does live up. It is the only country where I can go as a Muslim and listen 5 times a day to the call of the muazzin, calling to prayer. It's the only country where I can do that. It is the only country in the Middle East and in the world where the Muslim Arabs can live secure. They cannot live secure in Yemen. They cannot live secure in Jordan. They cannot live secure in any country. I'm talking about the Muslims. I'm not talking about the Christians or Baha'is or Hindus and so on. Any Muslim wanting to live a life on the basis of what we talk about, individual liberty, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, will be bludgeoned to death, as happened only 2 weeks ago in Pakistan, in the capital of Pakistan, in Islamabad, a 23-year-old young student discussing, as 23-year-old young students do, always questioning the values, challenging the professors, either being humorous or seriously. And so this young student in Quaid-e-Azam University, which is the university in the name of the founder of Pakistan, was bludgeoned to death by a mob on the charges of blasphemy. And what blasphemy did he say? It has never been proven, never been established. So that's where it is. That 2,000 years later, with the foundation of the State of Israel, we can see as an example that there is a state that lives up to the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is a state which does not discriminate. And so the paradox, you're the psychologist, you can then explain it, that around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in other countries, who had no connection with Jews, had never possibly sat down and taken a cup of coffee with Jews. Indonesia, for instance, the largest Muslim country with over 230 million people, you go to an Indonesian, ask an Indonesian who is a Jew, he might think he's a Jew is a guy with horns, because that's how the Arabs have been describing their Jews, protocol of Zion and so on. He doesn't know anything about it, but he is driven to this bigotry, this anti-Semitism, by this interpretation of Islam that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And what is it about? I think it is part of the repressed neurosis, the guilt, that they themselves cannot live up to the values that Israel lives up to. And therefore, you have to deny Israel. And you have to deny all the various ways that you can deny. At the UN, and in Toronto, in our university campuses, or wherever you go, you've got to deny it. The sad part of it is, and I'll conclude with this, you haven't had time. The sad part of it is, for instance, here we are in Canada, we are at the premier university in Canada. In the last 100 years, Canada was present in all the details that leads up to the making of Israel. Canada was a member of the League of Nations. So Canada was obliged to recognize the Palestine Mandate and did. Canada, for instance, was represented by Lester Pearson during the debate in 1947-48, and Justice Ivan Rand, and they voted for the Special Commission on Palestine, the majority report. And we know the role Canada played, and yet today it is the Canadian politicians who are nurturing the scorpions in our midst, the anti-Semites and the Islamists. It is our Canadian media that is the same thing about the United States. France is, of course, gone completely berserk. So here it is, back again. We're dealing with a global anti-Semitism arise some 70 years after the Holocaust.
So we've started to get some very interesting questions and contextual elaborations and ideas from the audience. There's a question, I think, that goes to the whole panel, asking whether declaring the Balfour Declaration as inimical to Palestinian Arab interests indicates that Arabs are still not prepared to accept a Jewish state, and that the extermination of Jews is and has been a historical objective. Do you see that to be the case, and do you see paths to overcoming that?
Can I look at that sentence again? Would the panel agree that by declaring the Balfour Declaration inimical to Palestinian Arab interests, that this indicates that the Arabs are still not prepared to accept a Jewish state, and that extermination of the Jews is and has been their historical objective? Well, I'm not sure who would declare it that way. What was interesting to me is that the Balfour Declaration specifically says it doesn't derogate from rights of other religious groups in the region. And as anyone who's been to Israel can see with their own eyes, or you don't even have to go there to know it, Muslims and Christians who are Israeli citizens have all the rights, but are missing the one obligation of compulsory military service. So I think that has been upheld 100 years after that was a condition. I think that condition has been met.
Two objections that were added in two separate questions were that there's an obstacle to giving up any land that has ever been under Muslim rule, so this idea that there cannot be a retreat. Yeah. And there was another question about how we read different surahs in the Quran together. So there are some that seem more Iranic or Pacific, and others that seem to call for more sanguinary relations with the Jews. And so I guess there's interest in the audience for how those things can be reconciled, or what tension they create.
Well, there's no theological basis to the first argument that land conquered by Muslims, Arab, Turks, Afghan, Persian, then becomes inviolable and cannot be reconquered. In fact, conquest is a political issue, and what is conquered physically, politically, can also be defeated politically and physically. So there is no basis in a theological argument for that. You don't hear about any credible Muslim leader talking about we are going to go and conquer Spain again, because that was for 800 years Andalusia, or we are going to reconquer whole portions of territory which are now part of the state of Russia, that were once part of the Ottoman Empire around the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea areas, so on and so forth. So no, there is no theological basis. About the verses from the Quran, yes, exactly. I mean, religion that is based on a sacred text, which is what all three Abrahamic religions are based on, sacred texts, are open to interpretation. And the question is how things are interpreted. The hermeneutics of reading texts. The Jews and the Christians have gone through the phases of for lack of a better term, I might say modernization. Look, I mean, this is the 100th anniversary of Balfour Declaration. This is also the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther pinning the 95 Thesis on a church door this year, 1517, October. It took several centuries for Europe to break out to understanding the Bible in modern sense. It was an issue that was fought over, immensely bloody, and a lot of disasters all around. And one might say it's still not over. The Jews, they developed their own way of reading the text over the period of their exile in the diaspora, where they were not grounded in state. They carried their state in their pockets, so to speak, their Torah. And they developed the way to read and understand it in the context of the times in which they're reading. For the Muslim, I think the war or the battle of how the text is to be read in modern terms, in the light of modern values, has only just begun. And so it will take time, but it is going to be irreversible. It has begun and it's going to change. For instance, the women in the Muslim world are the spear carriers of the Reformation taking place. The media doesn't want to talk too much about it, but they are actually the spear carriers. The women will bring about the change. And it is the fight over gender rights which is again another coded way to say how will the Quran be interpreted. So that is an ongoing thing. So my point about what the text says about the Jews is again to understand it in modern context of individual liberty, democracy, and most importantly, the recognition of the other. Islam became a world empire right at its origin. It didn't happen with Christianity. That took several centuries. You know, the joke I tell my student, if Constantine had not seen, according to legend, the cross on the top of the Malvern Bridge and become a Christian, and instead had heard the horns of ram in his ear and converted to Judaism, what would be the history? Because remember, the forefathers of Constantine was feeding Christians to the lions in Rome. So you see, the choices made, the recognition of the other, politics superseding religious faith, where politics, as someone said, when politics become religion, then it is no longer religion, it is an inquisition. That's what happened with Islam.
So, with regards to the idea of the interpretation of holy texts, let's say, well, if you're not holy when you read the text, then you won't interpret it properly. That's a good way to think about it. So let's say that you have hatred and deceit and arrogance in your heart and you read history. Well, then history is an infinite number of facts, and what you'll extract out from history, from your reading, is justification for your hatred, arrogance, deceit, and resentment. And you'll find all the facts you need to support that particular doctrine. There's no doubt about it. And I would say, and of course this is an oversimplification, but we'll proceed anyways with it, is that if you approach a text that a collective has determined has something divine about it, and you're unclean in your soul, then you'll extract out whatever justifies your pathology from it. And then you'll trumpet it as your virtue and find a target for your hatred. And well, and that's, I guess, partly why I think that if people would like peace, they have to actually desire peace. As individuals, they actually have to want peace. And then you read things so that you figure out a way to bring peace. But people generally don't want peace. They want a target for their hatred, or they want a target for their resentment. They want justification for their arrogance. And insofar as that's eternally the case, then we won't extract out whatever divine wisdom happens to be in the collective texts of our imagination.
So that touches a number of questions that we've been getting, and an issue that all three of you have raised about the tension between individual rights, individual psychology, and collective or communal rights, communal psychology, and communal historical and political forces. So if any of you have thoughts on how we disentangle, if that's what's needed, or draw on positive forces at both the individual or the social or communal level, it would be interesting to hear that. But there's a specific pointed question, which any of you can answer, but it's directed at Professor Peterson, about this problem of our tendency to blame others. So I guess you're making a kind of Solzhenitsyn point about a dividing line between good and bad forces running through everyone, and then, so that applies to us here in Canada as we try to have constructive dialogue informed by different considerations. But perhaps in the radius around Israel, it's compounded by historical facts like anti-Semitism, and also, I guess, that's where they keep Jerusalem. So there's that city of God angle. So using the lens of individual psychology or social psychology, are there some positive psychological paths forward?
Well, you know, if when you're working as a clinical psychologist, you basically, you encourage people. First of all, that's what you do. You encourage people. And I mean that directly, because what you do is you help them figure out what they're afraid of. that's blocking their way forward, you know, the way they know they should take. There's obstacles that are contaminated by fear, and they're shying away from them, and they have their reasons. Like, there's things to be afraid of, you know. And so you help people understand that there's something in them that will respond to a challenge voluntarily undertaken, and you make them larger than their fears. And there's nothing metaphysical about that, although it has a metaphysical element. It's very, very practical. You do that with children, right? You say, go out and play in the playground, you'll make some friends, and that'll be good for you. And the child's hanging around your legs and is afraid to move forward. And then they go out and they learn and they come back and they're stronger and they have friends. And you also help people develop. There's a strong stress on authenticity in all the great clinicians' writings. It doesn't matter who they are. You know, Freud wants you to learn the truth about your past, and to stop repressing, which is a form of deception. And Carl Rogers talked about authenticity, and Maslow talked about the developed person who was also authentic and honest. And so there's a tremendous stress on, let's say, honesty and courage as the redeeming virtues in clinical psychology. And plenty of that is attested to by the clinical data itself, which suggests that those virtues, let's say, are in some sense synonymous with health and certainly aid and abet health. And so the psychological issue, and I think it's paramount, this is partly why I'm a great admirer of Carl Jung, because he believed that the psychological factor had become paramount in the modern age, and that it's necessary for people, if we want peace, which to me is the alternative to total destruction, because we have that capability in our hands. If we want peace, then as nations, we have to want peace as individuals, and we have to act courageously, and we have to be honest. And there's no alternative to that. And the rest of it is, well, we'll leave it to the groups to fight among themselves. And well, we already know how that story turns out, and I would say it's pretty awful. So there's plenty that can be learned from the psychological perspective, and perhaps if you learn it properly, then you turn yourself into the sort of person who can look at the divine documents that we possess, let's say, and extract out the proper lessons for the future from them. We bloody well better hope that's the case, because, you know, it's the path that we've got, and if it doesn't work, well, then we're back to the horrors of the 20th century, except they'll be worse this time around. So